Rikstekes and Čucikas to podcast Live the Battlefield. Today we're going to talk about dawn of the Russian dominance in space exploration and espionage and how America lost the early space race. Yes, America lost early space race. So let's go dig deep into this topic right now. Many surprising and outstanding discoveries were produced during the 20th century, no question asked. Only a few events can compare to the Sputnik launch, which sent the first artificial satellite into orbit. On October 4th, 1957, a metal sphere the size of the beach ball made history. Beach ball, ushering in the space age of forever altering our perception of our place in the universe. Sputnik was much more than a technological marvel. It was the beginning of a new era of human creativity and a sign of human yearning to push the boundaries of what was possible. Her radio transmission, it was being heard around the world, both literally and metaphorically, because it was sent above the Earth's atmosphere. It not only marked the beginning of space exploration, but it also made a profound shift in global politics and popular mood. My name is Mario Bekes and welcome to the podcast Live the Battlefield. I'm the Guinness World Record holder on continuous broadcasting audio, and I'm the hero you never knew you needed. I spent 5 consecutive years in the combat in the war for democracy and freedom back in my home, ex-Yugoslavia, for my country, Croatia. I spent significant time in military and diplomatic security intelligence services, and my world evolving around espionage, investigations, and interrogation. And today, we're going to talk about Sputnik and the Cold War. Recently, there was a new Sputnik in 2021, Sputnik 5. Yeah, that was a vaccine Russian created for the COVID-19, but world didn't want that Sputnik 5. So let's go dig into this Sputnik and Cold War, the ideological, political, and military rivalry between the two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. Dominated era that gave rise to the Sputnik myth. The struggle between these countries, known colloquially as the Cold War, gradually turned into focused internal matters to explode areas of the space. Let me bring you quickly before we talk about launching the Sputnik. I don't remember as a kid, I was a teenager in the 80s, and I don't remember Ronald Reagan became the president of the United States, and the first statement we ever heard in communist Yugoslavia from US was by Ronald Reagan, Star Wars. Then we think it's a Jedi, it's a Darth Vader, it's whatever it is. But the thing is, Reagan stated that America has spaceships and everything in space ready to shoot from above down on Earth. And of course, communist countries were afraid. So what they did, they pumped the money to overcome to try to find a solution how to prevent possible invasion from the space by Americans. Now, Cold War, it wasn't a joke. It was a very difficult time for all sides. However, I must give the credit to the West why they won over the Cold War. Marketing and sales. We're going to talk about this some other time. But now, this was not a romantic adventure. It was a race for power, with each milestone representing a claim to supremacy in geopolitics and technology, East versus West. The Sputnik project was built against the backdrop of the Cold War rivalry, which was mirrored in many facets of the space race. Humans always want to conquer the space. They always wondered what's there in space. So, military objectives drove rapid advancements in missile technology in the years following World War II. And the father of all this Rockets. Werner von Braun is a German engineer and rocket scientist. He was transported to the United States as a part of Operation Paperclip. It's true, to work on missile development. During this time, the Soviet Union also acquired German missile technology and expertise. You know, the Victor has a spoils, Victor writes the history. So what they did, after the Germany capitulated, the Russians and the Americans, including English, they were searching for everything and anything they could get their hands on. Of course, over 5 years of the war, Russians and the Allies saw their nemesis, the Germans, with the new technology, new weaponry, and of course they knew what they're looking for. But as the Russians progressed, conquering more territory in Germany, Russians start digging earlier than the Americans. However, the Germans was more inclined to surrender to the Americans and English because of the treatment. Nothing didn't. Werner von Braun didn't do it to save his skin. Werner von Braun surrendered himself to the Americans, and he became the father of the Race to the Moon program as well. And he was the guy who created a V2 wonder weapon or vengeance weapon for the Hitler, first ballistic missile. Now, both countries have been testing increasingly powerful missiles, some of which can travel to the edge of space, so-called. By the mid-1950s, both United States and the Soviet Union had announced that they intend to launch artificial satellites into Earth orbit as a part of global science initiative to better understand physical status of Earth properties, whatever that means. However, few could have predicted the huge impact their initiatives would have. Nobody could understand what's going to happen. Hitler has a Werner von Braun to create a weapon, ballistic missile. Americans had a Werner von Braun to create rockets to go into space. But Russians has a German scientist as well who work on ballistic missiles, and they all created something new. Sputnik is created to Soviet Union's space program, specifically the covert research center, the Space Rocket Corporation, Sergei Korolev. The chief designer was capable and imaginative project manager. He built Sputnik with the help of the team of engineers and scientists. Sputnik, it's named after the Russian word for passenger or satellite, and had a robust, appealing design. Because a sphere has a least surface area for a given volume, it can endure extreme pressure during the launch, and that's why his size of the beach ball, and in the space environment, making a decision to choose spherical design was critical. Sputnik body is made of highly polished aluminum alloy, and it's made of two independent hemispheres that are joined together to reflect sunlight. 4 external radio antennas, purposely longer than the sphere diameter, were dotted around the satellite exterior. And you can see in today commercials or the movies from those times in the 50s, you can still see that ball with the 4 antennas going behind. It looks like unusual, but that was the first satellite in space by Russians. Now, it contains pressure and orientation maintenance mechanisms, radio transmitter, a battery, and a fan to manage the temperature. All of this in a size of the volleyball beach ball. Radio signals were carried back to Earth by these antennas that protruded from the one edge of the spherical to another. The transmissions were just short beeps that indicates the satellite was in operation but included very little information. However, it's a modest size, and the limits of the technology available at the time, Sputnik did not carry scientific instruments unlike many current satellites when you see them, big telescopes. The main goal was to demonstrate that artificial objects could be launched into the Earth's orbit, and Russians did the first. I remember during the war in Croatia, we had some technology from Russia. Just want to add on that Sputnik. So 6 days later, We still have the Russian technology in the shape or size of four military vehicles, and one of them is called the UAZ, and it was so robust. There was so many rivets and like so many screws outside, and the windows. There was no windows, a plastic cover, and I said to myself, Jesus, this is what we're using in 21st century? But then one of the old Kadroviks from the communist Yugoslavia officers said, one day they're going to be the nuclear explosion. And guess what? You can start it by pushing this truck. And I said like, interesting. Of course, we all wanted pressing the button, not the keys and, the big, diesel engines and everything else with the big holes like a fist size on the side of the vehicle. It was just a part of design. But Russians created the first artificial satellite, the first artificial intelligence, and they launched it on the 57. In human history was not reached a climax as was on October 4th, 1957, with the launch of Sputnik 1. Sputnik was the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth, having been sent into orbit by the R-7 Semyork, the first intercontinental ballistic missile ever. R-7 Semyork. The space age and the period of human space travel began with this historic event, 1957. The launch preparation took place at the remote Baikonur Cosmodrome in the steppes of Kazakhstan in complete secrecy. With bated breath, the Sergei Korolev team watched as the clock approached the scheduled launch time. The R-7 rocket sprang into life at 10:20 p.m. Moscow time, taking off from the launch site and soaring across the night sky. Sputnik was sent into orbit a little while later when the rocket's last stage shut down. Now, the farthest point from the Earth, or roughly 947 kilometers, and Perich, the closest point to Earth, or roughly 227 kilometers, Sputnik 1 was launched into elliptical low Earth orbit. The spacecraft completed one orbit of the Earth every 96 minutes or so, clocking in at a speed of about 29,000 kilometers per hour. 29,000 kilometers per hour. Following successful deployment, Sputnik started sending out signal again to Earth. Radio operators worldwide have detected the basic beep-beep noises. That was the first transmission, beep noise. The information obtained from the satellite's radio signals, primarily its temperature and pressure, was priceless, even though it lacked any scientific instrumentation. Sputnik cleared the path for all upcoming satellites for data collection and telecommunication, proving that data transmission from orbit to Earth is feasible. Now, from October 4 to October 26, 1957, or until the transmitter batteries ran out, was the duration of the Sputnik 1 mission. The actual satellites, on the other hand, kept orbiting the planet for a few more months before slowly re-entering atmosphere and disintegrating on January 4th, 1958. So it's actually come back to the Earth in pieces. But what that actually caused that launch of the Sputnik? You can guess. Panic in America. A reaction through the world. And how is it even possible? Well, if we go in those times, in 1950s, particularly 1957, the Cold War was just warming up. It's becoming very tense then. Global politics were profoundly and immediately affected by Sputnik launch. But incidents sent shockwaves around the world, particularly in the United States, as it revealed that Soviet Union scientific supremacy and demonstrated their ability to fire intercontinental ballistic missiles. So it's not enough that Americans seeing the missile flying in space, but this is the same ballistic missile which can reach United States as well. Now, in the United States, the incident now referred as a Sputnik shock caused a surge of concern and reflection. The imagined balance of power was suddenly thrown off. And of course, in the quick developing field of space technology, it was the Soviet Union, not the United States, that emerged as the clear leader. Of course, this posed a clear threat to America's reputation as the most technologically sophisticated country following World War II. And now ask yourself, all these years, all these decades, and I was one of those victims of success of communism, we've been fed with successes of the Russia and how the communism is great. But can you imagine Americans now over there? They're in a panic. Look, America never been in a war, apart of the Civil War in, long time ago. But then First World War didn't touch them physically. Second World War, no, except Pearl Harbor and Hawaii. But mainland America never faced the war. So they never been in that position. But suddenly you have the Russians who's been decimated in the Second World War. The Russians who are backwards. Even Stalin was saying we are 50 years behind the Western world. And he wanted to reach this into these so-called 4 years or 5 years plans. I remember as a kid, and my father was saying to me, we have a 5-year plan again. I was like, what does that mean? And, when I asked, he will slap me because I don't understand. But America was afraid. And Russia was clearly winning because America was more technologically sophisticated country after World War of anybody else on the planet. As a result, the US education system was critically examined with a focus on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and the math. Federal funding for science, instruction, and research was also significantly increased. The space race, an intense struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States for supremacy in space exploration, began with the launch of Sputnik in many senses. Technological advanced quickly as a result of this rivalry, with one side trying to surpass the other. There was a rush of space mission in the years that followed, each one more ambitious than the last, leading up to Apollo moon landings in 1969. So took the Americans 10 years plus to catch up, but they got to the moon. The incident also increased the stakes in the Cold War from political standpoint. Why is that? The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which established the legal framework guiding international space activity, was the consequence of rising urgency surrounding negotiations of international space agreement. Now, we can't look at treaty today, from today's point of view, 60 years ago, because things have changed. You have now the superpowers of China, even India merging. The United Arab Emirates, they have their own satellite technology. So everybody tried to race into space. But that time, in 1960s, 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, was the two superpowers clinching each other against in space. Hence that treaty. The US government underwent a significant overhaul in response to the Sputnik launch in an attempt to catch up in the space competition. Of course, we need to do this. But on whose expense? The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, better known as the NASA, was founded in 1958. It was a clearly response to the Sputnik. NASA was response to the Sputnik, which was a significant turning point in US space exploration policy. This was one of the most notable examples of this. But the war, it just became warmer. Why? Because they have a Sputnik 2 launch. On November 3rd, 1957, the Soviet Union grabbed headlines once more with the historic launch of Sputnik 2, which came just 1 month after the first one. Through my podcasting, I try to explain to you what life was look like in communism. I was born in communism, I was living in communism, I was educated, and I was working, and I was a part of that establishment. And one thing what the government of every communist country was doing very well, because don't forget one thing, communism was not just beating the people, arresting them, shooting them. No, they couldn't, because they always claimed that the police and the army are the part of the populace, of the citizens. But what the government in communism was doing very well was to justify the money. Of course they were stealing. Of course there were all these type of fraud, I will call this, open fraud, because one thing that in communism, the money was coming from government. So of course, everyone was stealing government money, which comes from people. But the communist governments were very clearly on a foot to justifying expenditure. So Russians, it doesn't matter communist country, when something happened big, they need to grab attention of the people, not just the political or military, but on its own people. You see, we spent money. Sputnik 1, now comes the Sputnik 2. Now, what's happened in Sputnik 2? In the first one, we have the volleyball size beach ball, right? So that's the beach ball, right? You know what I mean? Just for the volleyball. Now the space Sputnik 2 has something else sending in space. It's sending something. It's live. It's alive. It's breathing. He can hear it. He can see it. Sputnik 2, launched in space, went much beyond the innovation of the first Sputnik mission. And who is that? Remember the Laika? Laika was the first living space traveler. The first living space traveler, dog by the name of Laika, was aboard this much larger and more sophisticated spacecraft than its predecessor. Compared to the Sputnik 1, Sputnik 2, the design was more different. Approximately 500 kilos was its weight, which was far greater than volleyball beach ball. The satellite had multiple compartments, including a power system, unit housing, scientific equipment for biological study, and locket chamber for Laika. So can you imagine, on 1957, November 3rd, Russians launched a second Sputnik. That Sputnik has a live being on board. It was the first space traveler, and her name was Laika. It was a dog. Now, as I say in previous explanation, my previous content of this podcast or this episode, I said how 1958 Americans launched and opened and started their response to the Russian cosmonauts and Russian satellites and Russian space exploration by starting the NASA. Now, that is 1 year later after the Sputnik 2. It's clearly Americans, they're lacking their knowledge, lacking their desire to conquer the space. So the Russians already have the ballistic missile which can fly into space, which means that ballistic missile can reach the United States and carry nuclear or atomic device on board. But it's not only that one. The Sputnik 1 was a small volleyball beach ball. But second one, it's a much more larger and carries the live being on board. And her name was Laika. Laika, unfortunately, did not survive. Did not survive the journey since the necessary technology to self-return living things from orbit had not yet been established. So it was ahead of the time. Russians. Now, concerns over the care and security of animals used in scientific study were brought up by the Sputnik 2 mission, which also brought attention to the moral difficulties associated with space travel. So if the Laika, the dog, cannot self-return to the Earth, I don't think so the human being can as well. Even though Laika mission ended tragically, it yielded important, if preliminary data on how living things react to spaceflight settings. In the end, this made human spaceflight possible. So Laika was clearly sacrificed so that people can go into space. Following the success of Sputnik 1 and 2, a string of progressively sophisticated and intricate Sputnik missions were launched, leading up to Sputnik 5. And as I say, Sputnik 5 has the same name as a vaccine Russians launched in 2021 for the COVID-19. Now, Sputnik 5 was successfully brought back the canines Belka and Strelka from space in August 1960. So K9, Belka and Strelka. This mission served as evidence of both the Soviet Union's pioneering role in the early years of space exploration and the swift advancement of the space technology. With the expectation of the Sputnik series, the Soviet Union went to accomplish important first in-space exploration, such as Yuri Gagarin. He was the first successful manned space journey on board Vostok 1, name of the rocket, in April 1961. Later, they accomplished the first spacewalk by Alexei Leonov in 1965 and the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshovka, on board Vostok 6 in 1963. The Sputnik missions created the scientific and technological groundwork for this advancement. Needless to say that the United States was lacking any possible and feasible material, their planes to go into space. They have a Werner von Braun, who was the father of the modern space traveling, particularly the moon. However, even with his help, Russians already been in space. Then the spacewalk, they launched a couple dogs in space, which they come back alive, Stelka and Belka, and Yuri Gagarin, who was the first man in space. Of course, following up with the spacewalk and the first woman. Needless to say that Americans were the furious. Wouldn't you be? You know, you see the Russia as a less advanced country, but yet they done things. You're still contemplating, still making plans how to do it. Hence why the Cold War was being very, very hot and hotly contested, not just in space, but in the corridors of the embassies, in the parks and everywhere else. So let me know why Americans haven't been first in orbit around the Earth, but then the Russians were. Thank you for watching Live the Battlefield. Let me know in the comment section below, what do you think? Why the Russians are more advanced and more faster in space than Americans? Thank you.